In the long, violent memory of the Roman Empire, there are emperors whose names echo with glory, and there are emperors whose legacies are whispered only in fear. But among them all, only one suffered a fate so shocking, so humiliating, that even ancient historians struggled to describe it. His name was Publius Licinius Valerian, the only Roman emperor who was ever taken alive by an enemy. And what happened to him inside the court of the Persian king is so nightmarish that Rome itself tried to bury the story. But history does not forget. It only waits. Our story begins in a world collapsing under its own weight. Rome, the giant of the ancient world, was crumbling. Plague spread like smoke across the land. Armies were in revolt. Borders were burning. And rising in the east was a new power, the Sassanid Persian Empire, ruled by a king who saw himself not just as a monarch, but as a living god, Shapur I. He was brilliant, merciless, and determined to carve Rome into pieces. Valerian, already an old man when he became emperor, inherited a world on fire. His empire was choking under disaster. Cities rebelled. Enemies pressed from every side. The plague took entire legions within days. And to the east, Shapur was waiting, sharpening the axe. Valerian believed he could stop him. Perhaps he thought he could still save Rome. But he had no idea that he was walking directly into a trap that would end in one of the most horrifying punishments in ancient memory. As Valerian marched toward Persia, his soldiers were starving, exhausted, diseased. Reports from the time describe entire camps littered with corpses, men too weak to hold their shields, horses collapsing mid-stride. Yet the emperor pushed forward. He believed the dignity of Rome depended on him. He believed an emperor must never kneel. But soon he would kneel, not to save Rome but to beg for his life. The final battle came near the city of Edessa. It was not a battle for glory, it was a disaster. Persian cavalry cut through the Roman ranks like fire across dry wheat. Thousands fell. Others fled. And then the plague struck again, tearing through Valerian's army at the very moment they needed strength. In the chaos, the emperor, the ruler of the greatest empire on earth, was surrounded. What happened next remains one of the darkest turning points in ancient history. The Roman emperor was taken alive, captured, bound, dragged from the battlefield like a common criminal. For Rome, this was unthinkable. The emperor was supposed to be divine, untouchable, chosen by the gods. Yet here he was, chained, trembling, and powerless, headed straight for the court of a king who despised everything Rome stood for. Shapur I had been waiting for this moment. In his eyes, Valerian was not a prisoner. He was a trophy, proof that Persia had finally eclipsed Rome. And from the moment Valerian was brought before him, the Persian king made sure the world would never forget what happened when the eagle of Rome fell into the hands of the lion of Persia. For Valerian, the humiliation began immediately. Every time Shapur mounted his horse, he ordered the Roman emperor to kneel before him, and he used Valerian's back as a human footstool. The most powerful man in the Western world, reduced to a platform for another king's boots. Some say Shapur would laugh, reminding Valerian that Rome was nothing but a fading shadow. Others say he remained silent, because the humiliation spoke loudly enough on its own. Captured Roman soldiers watched their emperor used like an animal, and they wept. They begged for Shapur to show mercy, but mercy was a word the Persian king had removed from his kingdom long ago. Valerian was kept in chains, starved, tortured, dragged around from city to city like a human symbol of Rome's defeat. And every step of this journey broke him further. But Shapur was not finished. His empire demanded a message written not on stone, not on scrolls, but on flesh. And so began the most terrifying chapter of Valerian's captivity, the one Rome would later try to erase. Because according to ancient accounts, the end of Valerian's life was not a simple execution. It was a spectacle. A slow, deliberate, and unimaginably brutal punishment meant to stain Roman honor forever. Some say he was flayed alive, his skin peeled from his body as Shapur's court watched. Others say his body was preserved, stuffed with straw, and displayed like a grotesque statue in a Persian temple. And some claim his skin was dyed red and hung on a wall as a warning. This is what happens to kings who defy Persia. But the truth, the real truth, is far more disturbing than any of the legends. Because new evidence suggests something even worse, something Rome never wanted the world to know. And that is where our story turns next. When Valerian entered the heart of the Persian Empire, he was no longer a man. He was a message, a living monument to Shapur's victory. Cities gathered to stare at him the way one might stare at a fallen god. Children whispered that he was cursed. Elders looked upon him with fear, believing that any empire whose rulers suffered such humiliation was doomed. And in Rome, rumors began to spread like rot through the Senate hall. The emperor has been taken. But no one could imagine just how far his torment would go. Valerian was moved from place to place, paraded before nobles, dragged beside Shapur's horse as the king rode triumphantly. They say Shapur would raise his hand, and Valerian had to kneel instantly, waiting to be stepped on. Roman captives living as slaves in Persia watched their emperor's degradation, unable to intervene, forced to endure a humiliation even deeper than their own. Every day Valerian lived was another reminder that Rome had been conquered without the city walls ever falling. But soon, whispers in the Persian court began to change. The humiliation was not enough. There were priests, magi, who believed a Roman emperor held immense symbolic power, power that needed to be absorbed, consumed, dismantled. The presence of such a man was dangerous, even spiritually. Unless his end was turned into a ritual, they said, the gods might favor Rome again. And so Shapur, who saw himself not just as a king but as a divine conqueror, began to plan a death so symbolic, so grotesque, that it would echo across the world. Valerian was already sick. Years of plague, starvation, and captivity had reduced him to a thin, trembling shell. Some accounts say he begged for mercy. Others insist he held on to his pride until the end. But it no longer mattered. Shapur wanted a spectacle, and the Persian Empire was ready to watch. The day chosen for Valerian's end was neither announced nor recorded. But ancient historians claim there were torches lining the courtyard, silk banners fluttering in the wind, and priests chanting in the old tongue. Valerian was dragged out in chains, his legs barely able to carry him. He might have thought it would be another day of humiliation, another day of being used as a footstool. But this time Shapur did not mount his horse. This time he looked at Valerian, and smiled. According to the Roman historian Lactantius, the only surviving detailed account, Shapur ordered Valerian to approach. And as the emperor struggled forward, hands reached out and pulled him to the ground. Then, slowly, carefully, methodically, they began to flay him alive. Some say the skin was taken from his arms first, then his chest, then his back. Others say Shapur looked into Valerian's eyes the entire time, watching the pain, the fear, the breaking of a man who once ruled half the known world. Persian records are silent on this event. They do not confirm it, nor do they deny it. But Roman sources insist it was true, that the greatest enemy of Persia deserved a punishment that would be remembered for millennia. Valerian's screams, they said, echoed through the palace walls. His guards were ordered not to look away. Some fainted. Others vomited. A few turned their heads and were whipped for doing so. It was a moment meant to transform the Roman emperor from a humiliated captive into something even more unsettling, an eternal warning. When Valerian finally died, the torture did not end. His body, still warm, was skinned completely. The skin was treated, dyed red, and hung in a temple as a reminder of Persia's triumph over Rome. His empty body was stuffed with straw, restored to human shape, and placed in a posture of submission, a grotesque, lifeless echo of the emperor who once commanded 1,000,000 men. This is the version of history Rome wanted to deny. They buried the story, called Lactantius a liar, insisted Shapur fabricated everything. Because the truth was too painful. Rome's emperor had not died in glorious battle. He had not sacrificed himself for the empire. He had been tortured to death like a criminal. And there was nothing Rome could do about it. But here is where the story takes an even darker turn. Because scattered Persian inscriptions discovered centuries later reveal something far more complex. Something that suggests the Romans might have been lying, and the Persians might have been lying, and the world has never truly known what happened to Valerian in those final moments. Modern historians now believe the truth is buried somewhere between horror and propaganda. And the real fate of Valerian, the actual ending, may be even more disturbing than the ancient accounts. because it suggests that Valerian's death was only the beginning of a far greater humiliation, one that Rome tried desperately to erase from its history. And that truth is what comes next. The story of Valerian's death should have ended with his execution, whether brutal or simple. But history is rarely so satisfied. The truth, like a shadow stretching across the centuries, grew darker with every retelling. And the more scholars searched, the more they uncovered traces of a secret neither Rome nor Persia wanted to preserve. A secret that suggests the death of Valerian was not the final act of humiliation, but the opening chapter of something far worse. For centuries, Rome insisted Valerian was treated honorably, that he lived in Persia as a respected, protected guest. Their chronicles speak of negotiations, diplomacy, and even letters written by Valerian from captivity. But these accounts lack dates, lack signatures, lack the weight of truth. They read like desperate attempts to protect the empire's dignity, to hide the unbearable fact that Rome, the eternal empire, had allowed its emperor to be captured alive. But then came the inscriptions. Carved into ancient Persian rock reliefs, high on the cliffs of Nakshi-Rustam, where gods, kings, and dead empires sleep eternally. And there, chiseled into stone, was an image that sent chills down the spine of every historian who decoded it. Shapur on horseback, triumphant, and beneath him, kneeling in defeat, was the unmistakable figure of a Roman emperor. Some believe that figure is Valerian. Others argue it is symbolic. But the message is unmistakable. Persia wanted the world to remember. Rome wanted the world to forget. But there is another layer to the mystery, one almost entirely lost to time. Persian court documents, fragments of Zoroastrian ritual texts, hint at something chilling. The idea that Valerian may have been kept alive for years after his defeat not as a prisoner, but as a ritual object, a living symbol of cosmic order turned upside down. In Zoroastrian belief, the humiliation of a king could serve as a spiritual purification, a cosmic balancing of good and evil. To keep him alive in captivity, broken, diseased, powerless, this was not just punishment. It was ritual domination. A way to show that Persia had inverted Rome's destiny. Imagine it, Valerian, aging and decaying, forced to live in a state of perpetual shame, displayed occasionally at festivals as proof of Persia's divine favor, forced to kneel when the priests demanded it, forced to witness the rise of a foreign god-king whom he once dismissed as inferior. Some records even imply that children of high Persian families were brought to see him, the living corpse of Rome, to understand what happens to those who defy the Shahanshah. Years may have passed this way. Years. Until the old emperor, weakened by plague, torture, and despair, became little more than a breathing relic. And then he disappeared. Not just from records, not just from inscriptions, but from existence itself. No grave. No tomb. No burial site. No confirmed remains. Nothing. A ghost emperor. Some historians argue that the flaying story was invented by Rome to make Shapur look like a savage. Others argue that Rome hid the truth because they were ashamed of how long Valerian actually suffered. And then there are those, the ones who dig too deep, who follow the whispers, who claim the truth lies in the desert temples once used for ritual desecrations. Places where enemies of the empire were displayed not as warnings, but as offerings. If Valerian's body was truly stuffed and preserved, as some Roman sources say, then where did it go? Some believed it hung in a Persian shrine for centuries, removed only when the empire converted to Islam. Others think Shapur sent it to another kingdom as a gruesome diplomatic gift. And then there is the most terrifying possibility of all. What if Valerian never died in captivity? What if Shapur kept him alive, barely, until the end of his own life? What if Valerian was forced to kneel beside Shapur's deathbed, the final humiliation for a king who lived and died in chains? Modern historians can piece together fragments, inscriptions, coins, and scars on the land, but they cannot rebuild the truth entirely. Some secrets are buried too deep, too deliberately. And sometimes the absence of evidence is itself the loudest evidence of all. Rome erased Valerian from its memory because his fate proved something the empire could not accept. That Rome was not invincible. That the gods could abandon even their chosen. That an emperor could be reduced to a spectacle for foreign crowds. And Persia too seems to have buried something. They carved images of victory, yes, but not a single Persian text describes Valerian's final moments. Not one. For an empire that recorded triumphs in precise, glorious detail, this silence is deafening. It is as if Shapur wanted the world to see the image of victory, but wanted the truth of the emperor's end to vanish into smoke. A secret victory is more powerful than a public one. A hidden humiliation becomes legend. And legends, unlike recorded history, cannot be challenged. Valerian entered Persia as a ruler. He lived there as a captive. He died, however he died, as a warning. A warning carved not in stone, not in scrolls, but in the memory of two empires who never dared to speak the full truth. Today all that remains of him is a scattering of conflicting stories, a ruined battlefield, a few carved figures on a mountain cliff, and a legacy soaked in pain, fear, and unanswered questions. The desert wind has erased the footprints. The temples are silent. The bodies have turned to dust. But somewhere in the endless space between Rome's pride and Persia's glory lies the truth of what really happened to the emperor who was once the most powerful man on earth, and died as the most humiliated. And until that truth is uncovered, Valerian's final secret remains one of the darkest mysteries in royal history, a tale too horrifying for Rome, too triumphant for Persia, and too unbelievable for the modern world. A tale only whispered, on throne unknown.